Welcome everybody at Elaad. Before I start, I would like to mention a few things, especially around safety. You see a lot of equipment here. Please do not touch anything. Might be high voltage involved, so please don't try it. For the acoustics, as you can hear, if there's some talking, it will get quite loudy quite fast, so please try to keep it low. When it comes to safety, we have emergency exits there and there. The restroom is also, if you go out there, on the right side. As a last part, you are allowed to make photos of the presentations, but please do not make photos of any of the equipment here, because we are testing them, and it's not allowed to make pictures of that. So, welcome at Elaad. This is our lab, so our testing lab. And Elaad is an innovation and knowledge center focused around, obviously, electric vehicle charging. We do extend a bit more, if you look on your left side, into inverters, heat pumps, and things like that. Also high power equipment connected to the grid. We are a foundation, so we're not commercial, we're non-profit. And we are actually founded 15 years ago by the Dutch grid operators to research the impact of electric vehicles to the grid. So we do a lot of, as you can see, power quality testing. What will the charger mean for the grid? What will the car do to the grid? We do a lot of research on that part. We do tender support, things like that. And one of the activities, obviously, is cybersecurity. So we do predictions, we work on innovation, and we actually realize. And it goes from data analytics to home energy management systems, as you see in the top right, to protocols, vehicle to grid, and the actual realization into the actual networks. So when it comes to smart charging, power quality, tendering support, and the test lab here. So who am I? My name is Han van der Brink. Background in IT and cybersecurity. I've got 10 years experience in the EV infrastructure. I'm also an ethical hacker at the Dutch Institute of Vulnerability Disclosure, so where we basically scan the entire internet, try to find vulnerabilities in devices or appliances, and then report them in a responsible way to the manufacturers. I'm responsible for cybersecurity at ElaadNL, and I'm the host of today. So the program for today will be me starting with the welcome. Then Wilco van Beijnum, my colleague, will talk about the state of the cybersecurity in the charging infrastructure. Maarten Hoeve from ENCS will talk you through the new requirements from Elaad ENCS. And after the break, we will have Bruno van Hoek talking about, also my colleague, talking about ISAC. We have Bart Thomassen from RDE talking about the upcoming EU regulation. And Wilco and I will perform a live hack on stage. Thank you. Wilco, can I invite you on stage?
Thank you. Great. Hello, everyone. EV charging infrastructure is a relatively new technology that's playing an increasingly important role in our society. With this, the risk of a cybersecurity attack on these systems also grows, especially since cybersecurity is often an underexposed topic in these kind of rapidly developing sectors. Since a large-scale hack on charging stations could disrupt the power grid and even cause a blackout, cybersecurity is of vital importance. Today, I'll walk you through the most common and critical vulnerabilities we found during our cybersecurity testing of EV charging stations to both increase awareness and provide practical steps that manufacturers and charge point operators can take to better protect their systems. I'm Wilco van Beijnum. I work here at ElaadNL as a cybersecurity expert, and I test charging stations on cybersecurity here. Like Han van der Brink, I'm also an ethical hacker at the IVD, and I have an expertise in IoT hacking, which charging stations are, of course, a part of. I already have 21 publicly known vulnerabilities on my name related to charging stations, and there are many more vulnerabilities that I've discovered here at ElaadNL that we've reported directly to manufacturers. So most of the hype around EVs today, if you look at the news, is focused on range, price, sustainability. But the attack surface that EV charging infrastructure exposes is something that's not that often talked about. Still, as you can see, searching for articles related to cybersecurity issues in the sector, we see that there are still quite some problems, and some of these problems are even actively being exploited in the real world. So you might think, what are the risks involved when it comes to cybersecurity of charging stations? Well, first of all, there are of course risks for you as an EV driver or a company that's using EVs. Of course, it can be very annoying if you cannot charge your car, or if you're, for example, a transport company, it would be very annoying if you drive all electric trucks and your charging doesn't work and you cannot drive your trucks. Furthermore, if you drive an EV, you probably have a charging card with which you can charge at public charging points. Of course, you have to provide some personal information to get that card, like, for example, your address, your name, but also maybe bank details, credit card information, so the provider of that charging card can charge you for the charging that you performed. And of course, this information could be leaked by a hacker if he attacks the company that manages these charging cards. And a hacker could even manipulate financial details of transactions, for example, charge you more at a charging station than you actually charged. Furthermore, there are also, of course, risks for the charge point operator, so the company that manages these charging stations. An hacker might be able to damage equipment once he has hacked it. For example, by manipulating firmware, you could corrupt the firmware, maybe install ransomware on there. But you might even go further and cause safety issues by manipulating the firmware in such a way that you change the electrotechnical properties of a charging station, remove certain safety limitations, for example. And of course, all of this would then also lead to a loss of reputation and revenue for a CPO. And finally, like Harm already said, we're part of the, or at least financed by the grid operators. And also for the grid, there's a big risk when it comes to charging stations. These devices consume a lot of energy. And if you manage to hack enough charging stations and you would, for example, shut them all off at once or overrule smart charging rules that limit the speed of the charging, then you could cause a regional grid overload or even a national or international blackout if you do this at a large enough scale. So let's look at the attack vectors that are present when it comes to EV charging infrastructure. At the center, of course, we have the charging station itself. We can, of course, physically access this charging station, open it up, mess with the insides, but that might not even be needed to attack a charging station. Charging stations are often not connected to the internet, connected to a network, so this could be an attack vector. These charging stations are then often also connected to a server in the cloud. Of course, this server could also be attacked, via which you can then attack the charging station, or the other way around. And finally, we also have the charging port of the charging cable of the charging station itself, which is something you might not consider if you don't think about it, but this charging cable communication is also quite complex and can be an attack vector to gain access to the charging station. So first of all, why does all of this matter? You might notice that during the rest of my presentation, a lot of the vulnerabilities that I describe are focused on particular charging stations. And you might think, well, hacking one charging station doesn't really do much, right? I would need an exploitation that can attack multiple charging stations or a lot of charging stations to do anything interesting. But still, attacking one charging station can also be a problem. First of all, like we already described, you could compromise the safety of a charging station by hacking it. But from hacking one charging station, you could also pivot to other charging stations that might be connected to the same network, or pivot to a server that is connected to the same network. So from access to this charging station, go to access to other devices. And finally, having access to one charging station might allow you to discover more vulnerabilities than you might be able to discover without this access. So this, if you look at a charging station and you get complete access to the firmware and you can analyze how these files work and so on, you might be able to discover exploits that you weren't previously able to find. So first, let's look at the attack vector between the car and the charging station, the charging cable. So as an attack scenario, we see that a lot of charging stations are using so-called high-level communication. Especially this is the case for DC charging stations, so the fast charging stations you see, for example, along the highway. Also we're starting to see this protocol being used in some AC charging stations now, particularly those supporting vehicle-to-grid. And this specification, DIN specification 7121 or ISO 15118, this communication can be manipulated to gain access to the charging station or the car. You might consider a scenario where, for example, you have a malicious car and it drives by charging stations, it charges there, and one by one it infects all the charging stations, and then, or even you might have malicious charging stations that infect the car once it charges there, and you could even consider a scenario where these are combined and you're able to spread malware via this way. So how can we test this? Well, here at ElaadNL we have both an EV simulator and EV supply equipment, so charging station simulator. In the picture on the right you can see the EV charging station simulator. So we can connect a charging station to this device, or EV simulator, sorry. You can connect a charging station to this device and then it will start a charging session, and once this charging session has started, we can try to mess with this communication that is present. So this high-level communication that I talked about is actually Ethernet-based. So pretty much the same protocol as is being used when you connect your laptop to the internet or your phone. And we can simply conduct a port scan here to find if there are any open ports that should not be there. So what do we see there? Well, if we look at these open ports and the services that are running, we investigated pretty much all the DC charging stations here at ElaadNL, and we see that around 50% of the charging stations have some port open on the charging cable that should not be there. So this seems to be a very big problem that charging stations manufacturers don't really seem to be aware of. On most of these charging stations that expose something, we see that SSH is exposed, which is a service to remotely manage the charging station, to log into it and gain access to the operating system. And you do need login information to get into this SSH connection, but still you might be able to, for example, via phishing or something, gain access to this password and then log into the charging station this way, and especially if this password is the same across all the charging stations of a manufacturer, then that's of course a big concern. Furthermore, we've also seen some charging stations where the web management interface is exposed. So we see that often charging stations feature a web interface where you can configure things like the backend that it's connected to, also the charging limitations, how fast it can charge, these kind of things. And sometimes this interface can then also be accessed via the charging cable. Luckily, in all cases that we found, also once again requiring a login, But like I said before, especially if it's the same everywhere, or if it's a weak password, you might be able to brute force it and simply gain access to the full configuration of the charging station via the charging cable. Then we've also seen some charging stations that expose MQTT, a messaging protocol that was used for internal communication between components of the charging station. And here, this service was not even protected by a password, so we could see directly internal communication of the charging station over this charging cable, which is, of course, not something you want. And we've seen some other services as well, but these are the most notable ones. What's interesting to note is that more recently we've also started testing this on EVs to see if there are any open ports on there. And luckily, we have not found anything on that side so far. So manufacturers of EVs seem to be doing better on that front. But of course, that doesn't mean that it never occurs. So we will definitely keep looking into that. Finally, good to note that even if there aren't any open ports, aside from the normal communication happening between the charging station and the car, then of course an attacker might still be able to abuse this normal communication to find exploits in there. For example, buffer overflow exploits, or these kind of things could also be present there. Next, network access. So we see that a lot of charging stations, especially the public charging stations, are connected to the internet. Of course, they need to be able to handle payment information, see who's charging at the charging station and charge them accordingly. Also for management of the charging station, for example, to install updates. And once an attacker has gained access to the local network of the charging station, for example, via another exploit or by physical access, or sometimes these charging stations are even directly accessible from the internet and have a public IP address. Then we can manipulate the web traffic or access exposed services of the charging station. And furthermore, charging stations might also be configurable over Bluetooth, which we especially see often on the consumer side, where these charging stations connect to an app and you can change the settings. And of course, this Bluetooth communication could also be vulnerable. So what can we test there? Well, first again, a port scan. If we discover any web interfaces, we can look for common web vulnerabilities, such as the ones described in the OWASP Top 10. But also for other services, you might be able to brute force credentials if they are weak credentials, or if the default password was not changed, for example. Or exploit other known vulnerabilities, especially if software is outdated and there are known vulnerabilities in there. Then for the traffic, we can try to intercept the traffic, see if any plain text communication is happening, and even if it's not, then we can try to break the TLS encryption by conducting a man-in-the-middle attack on there. To make all of this a bit easier, we've also developed our own quick scan tool, which scans for some of these vulnerabilities completely automatically. So we can speed up our charging station testing and really quickly get a first look at the basic cybersecurity stance of the charging station and focus more time on the charging stations that seem especially interesting when it comes to cybersecurity. And finally, we can also, of course, have a look at the app of a charging station if it has one, and see how that communicates with the charging station, if anything weird is happening there. So what are the kind of vulnerabilities we see here? Well, we see a lot of charging stations that are running outdated software, even if you have a firmware version that's like only 1 year old. We see charging stations that are running software that are multiple years old with known vulnerabilities in them. So of course, as a manufacturer of charging stations, you should make sure to not only install the software once, and once it works, but also keep this up to date. So that's something to definitely focus on. Furthermore, we see a lot of issues with user input filtering and injection vulnerabilities, especially on the side of the Bluetooth communication and the web interfaces. These are often services, also OCPP connections, by the way, These are things that are often implemented by the manufacturer itself, and we see that a lot of mistakes are made here in the programming of these services. And we see vulnerabilities like, for example, on the website, cross-site scripting, where an attacker could execute code in someone else's browser, but also SQL injection, where you could execute arbitrary database commands on the charging station and, for example, gain access to passwords of other users, or charging cards, charging card information, that kind of things. But even command injection, where via a vulnerable field you can directly execute an operating system command and basically completely take over the charging station and do whatever you want with it. And something to also especially pay attention to here is the handling of files. Files are often much more complex to validate than, for example, a simple numeric field or text field. For example, when it comes to backups that you can download from the charging station and then restore, or firmware updates, or maybe you can upload a picture that is then shown on the screen of the charging station of a logo. And we see that often the validation of these files also goes wrong, and you can manipulate these files to ultimately also execute commands on the charging station and basically take it over completely. Then also we see issues with memory management. Often the services running on the charging station are written in native languages like C or adjacent languages. And we see that buffer overflow issues and related memory issues are often commonplace in these charging stations. So make sure to properly manage the memory of your applications. Then also we see issues with both authentication and authorization. So authentication is the logging in, and then authorization is the validation that once you're logged in, or once you want to access something, that you are indeed logged in. So on the authentication side, password management, like I already mentioned, a lot of charging stations use default passwords that are the same across all charging stations of a manufacturer. Of course, this is not a secure practice, and we highly recommend to either preferably generate a random password for every charging station you produce, but at the very least force a user in the provisioning process to change the password to something secure and random. And then on the authorization side, we have also seen some broken access control. So this means that you can access certain resources that you should not be allowed to access without logging in, but still you can access them without logging in. So for example, we've seen charging stations where you could download a backup of the charging station's configuration without logging in. These kind of issues are easy to prevent just by checking for every web page of your application. Is the user indeed logged in? Is the session valid? But it's something that's often overlooked. And then finally, also the network traffic. I already talked a bit about this. When you're using communication with a backend, of course, first of all, make sure that it's encrypted in the first place. We've seen some charging stations that communicate over plain HTTP, which is, of course, not great. So make sure to use TLS and a modern version at that. But also make sure to properly validate the certificates the TLS connection uses. Because if the certificates are not validated, a man-in-the-middle attack could take place, and you can just use whatever certificate you want to generate and still gain access to the encrypted traffic. Finally, firmware extraction manipulation. Manipulation I already talked a bit about with the handling of files. Make sure that you properly check your firmware once it's uploaded to the charging station. Make sure that it has a public-private cryptographic signature. So you sign it with a private key that only you know, and then the charging station can check if the firmware is valid by using its public key. And then you can also encrypt the firmware to further enhance security. Because firmware extraction is something that we also commonly do here. So we Once we obtain a firmware update, either sometimes you can download it from the manufacturer's website, or you can get it directly from the charging station, something I will talk about later. You can extract it and try to find vulnerable information in there, for example, API passwords, API keys, try to reverse engineer programs that are running on the charging station to more easily find vulnerabilities there. Let me get some water. Thank you. Then finally the physical access. So how can you get physical access? Well, of course, you could use brute force, get a hammer or a drill or something and gain access to the charging station. But a more subtle approach might, of course, be using lockpicking, or even for AC charging stations and some DC charging stations as well. You see that all you will need is a screwdriver to unscrew or unbolt the charging station and gain access to the insides. And something that's also interesting to note is that I previously talked about is that once you gain access to one charging station, you might gather more information that you can use to attack other charging stations. Well, of course, in that case, you could also simply buy a charging station for yourself, see what makes it tick, see how it works, and then use that knowledge to attack other charging stations once you find a vulnerability in there that you can more easily abuse. So what can we look at here? Well, first of all, we can look at internal connectors of the charging station, and also we can look at internal flash memory. Some charging stations might have SD cards in there that, for example, store logs, but also the solid memory of the charging station. So when it comes to internal connectors, of course, you're probably familiar with the Ethernet connection or the USB connection. With Ethernet, you could gain access to internal services without authentication. For example, if different components of the charging station communicate over Ethernet and the data is not encrypted. And then for USB, you might also be able to escape a GUI, maybe log into a console via that way, exit the GUI that is running on the charging station by default. And for UART and JTAG, those are both debugging ports. And if debug access is not disabled here, you might be able to gain access to the charging station this way and, for example, dump the memory or execute commands also. So make sure that these interfaces are disabled or at the very least protected by a very secure password. Then for flash memory, you might be able to gain access to sensitive logs. And also, like I talked about previously, the firmware might be interesting. And even if the memory is soldered onto the charging station, we might be able to desolder it, especially if we buy a charging station for ourselves for this kind of analysis, and use a reader such as the one shown on the slides to read this chip and get the data from it. And what could help here is, first of all, consider that this firmware could be accessed by an attacker, and make sure that the information that is stored in there is not sensitive, or at least does not lead to a complete takeover of other charging stations, for example, or a management server. And then, of course, also make sure that if it's possible, that you can also encrypt this memory. So then it's much harder to gain access to this storage. You might notice that there's one thing I haven't talked about yet, which is this part of the attack vectors. And this part is something we have not investigated much at ElaadNL yet, but it's something we're definitely concerned about. So I do want to mention it here, which is, first of all, the backend infrastructure. So often charging stations are connected to a backend server via OCPP. but there might also be a server that is from the manufacturer itself that uses an arbitrary communication protocol developed by the manufacturer. And especially if these charging stations are permanently connected to this cloud, then of course it can be very interesting as an attacker to then attack this cloud infrastructure, so you can then easily gain access to all of these charging stations. So definitely something to pay attention to, that this infrastructure is secure. And then finally, charging cards. As you can see in this news article from the NOS on 2019, charging cards for electric cars can be copied effortlessly. Well, this is still the case. All that's used for the authentication of a charging session is the UID of a card, so a simple numeric string. And you can easily copy these cards. And the sector is investigating more secure alternatives, but we're not there yet, so something to keep an eye out for. So, what can you do if you are, for example, a manufacturer of a charging station or a charge point operator, or in another way involved with EV charging infrastructure? Well, of course, first of all, we highly recommend to test your charging stations and related infrastructure on cybersecurity. We've developed requirements together with the European Network for Cybersecurity, which Maarten Verhoeven will talk more about in the next presentation as well. And these requirements can be used to check if your charging station and EV charging infrastructure is secure. Furthermore, we also highly recommend you to conduct pen tests on the charging station and related infrastructure to, at an early stage, find any vulnerabilities in there that might be present before an actual attacker can abuse them. Then, for the writers of software in particular, we highly recommend developers to familiarize themselves with cybersecurity more. A lot of these issues that I've previously described are well-known issues in the cybersecurity sector, vulnerabilities that have been present in systems for tens of years already, and these are easily preventable, a lot of them. So we highly recommend your developers to look at, for example, the OWASP top 10, the OWASP IoT top 10. These are lists of common vulnerabilities in web interfaces and IoT systems. And there are many other resources available online or physical courses as well to, with regards to secure development. And especially areas to pay attention to in our experience are, like I said, input validation, but also authentication and integrity of firmware. And then finally, I also want to mention that we also do testing here at ElaadNL. We can't provide any guarantees on the thoroughness or the effectiveness of cybersecurity scans, because this is something we do not as a service, but basically as a service to the community and not to the service of the developer or the producer of the charging stations. But you're highly recommended, highly invited to come here also to have your charging station tested on electrotechnical and compatibility sites, which my colleagues of the test lab are working on. That's it for my presentation. Thank you all for listening. Right now there's a test report available that describes all of the issues that I've presented in this presentation in more detail. So if you thought something was interesting in this presentation, please have a look at it. It's now available on our website, and you should be able to hopefully download it with this QR code. And if you have any further questions, you can always contact me via the email address here. Thanks. Any questions? Yes.
You mentioned all the attack vector, the smart card, for example, but did you also look into the mobile apps themselves that might have some issues with authentication?
So the question was, I think the microphone didn't work, right? Yes. So if I understood you correctly, the question was if we also investigated apps of the charging stations and if there are vulnerabilities in there. Yes, that's something we also look into, especially like how do they communicate with the charging station? Is proper authentication happening there? And sometimes this communication is directly to the charging station, but it might also go via a cloud server. So this is something we do also investigate, yes. I cannot talk about particular findings, unfortunately, but we have definitely seen some interesting stuff in there that indicates that there are issues there that should also be solved, yes.
Any more questions? Feel free. Yeah, there's one more.
If I were to do similar testing, is there any way I could borrow or rent this lab with all the electricity set up and that kind of stuff, so I don't need to build my own?
Good question. Yeah. I don't know if we can.
I think if you want to test your own device here, that's okay. But if you want to do other testing, then I think we need to get into talk. More questions?
You said the charging cards are copyable, or they're very easy. Are there any, for example, like OV chip cards that we can learn something from? Do you think that that's like the path we could follow?
Well, of course, if you look at the OV chip card, the first generation of that also turned out to be insecure and was replaced at a later stage. So I think in this case, it's a very similar case indeed. Of course, something we definitely have to consider is that a lot of these charging stations and charging cards are already in the field, and you don't want to have to replace all the charging stations simply because a new charging card was announced. So you also have this backward compatibility that you need to account for. But there are definitely some developments in there. I don't know if you know more about that harm in
the VILIN, so the branch organization of the charging infrastructure, is working towards a more secure solution, so they're actually going to pilot something there. More questions? Yeah, one in the back. Oh. He was first.
Do you provide certificates for that you have tested one particular charging station and found it to be, you have not found any problems? Do you provide some kind of paper to manufacturers or to the general public?
We ourselves don't do any certified testing, so for that you would have to go to a public lab that does these kind of cybersecurity tests. I think maybe Harm can tell more about that.
I think Maarten will talk more about that in the next presentation. There was one more question here.
Yeah, maybe this question is quite odd, but I really like to know some crime stories about cybersecurity. Do you have some nice stories from all over the world? Maybe other people in the public who can tell us some crime stories in charging infrastructure.
Somebody wants to share something? No?
I'm not 100% sure, but I've heard the story that taxi drivers in Stockholm, they were using the Revolut credit card to open up cards or charging accounts. They would max out the credit card and then cancel the subscription. So the EMSP was forced with paying the CPO while there was no credit card that has been validated. So this was one of the things that was going on. I think last year they announced on ICNC that the detection and having a multi-factor authentication was a way forward to solving this. But
I think you should talk to Peter van Zuilen. He is doing a lot of fraud detection. There was a question in the front here.
Hi. So concretely, I'll just give a quick context concerning the internet and communication vulnerabilities over HTTP. So basically how we are operating right now, we have public chargers connected through an APN provider, VPN provider, big SIM card company, which has their own private VPNs. So how vulnerable are like these connections going over 4G through their to their servers? Because they have internet breakout. We can access them from just by connecting to the VPN. We can configure everything.
Yeah.
So how would this like impact it? Because you're saying you have to use TLS. Some backends they don't allow for TLS. They don't use secure WebSockets or stuff like this. So how would this? Is this possibly impacted if you're already secured by a VPN, or how concerned should I be?
Well, first of all, if you're using software that doesn't support TLS, there might be more cybersecurity issues related to this application, and you might want to look into that. But apart from that, of course, using a private APN is already a good step to better protect your charging stations, especially if it's properly configured, and charging stations can indeed only be accessed via this VPN. But of course, then you do have to consider, for example, if one of these SIM cards is stolen out of a charging station, can they then simply gain access to the APN in that way and gain access to other charging stations or to the server? Or maybe they can get access to the APN in another way. Maybe there might be a vulnerability in the VPN software. So there are still ways an attacker could gain access to this network.
We have time for one more question. Is there still somebody? No? Thank you, Wilco. Please, another round of applause. Then I would like to invite on stage Maarten Hoeve. Maarten is Technical Director of ENCS, and we've been working together with ENCS for more than 10 years now, Maarten, right? And since 2017, we've had the first set of requirements, and now you're going to talk about the latest. Ja, alleen deze. Nope. I think I can I take this out? Do you have HDMI? Let's go the other way around.
It should use it as a second screen.
Yeah, I already did that. There you go.
Okay, yes, thank you, Harm. So, as Harm said, my name is Maarten Hoeve. I work for ENCS. Normally at ENCS, we work for different grid operators, so Alliander, Nexus, State, and also European grid operators on their cybersecurity. But I think 10 years ago, in 2015, Harm came to us because I think he was worried about the state of EV charging security. And since then, I've been sort of involved, particularly in developing the requirement sets that we have. So the idea we had in 2015 was essentially there's a lot of municipalities, cities, provinces buying charging stations, public charging stations, and they need to set some cybersecurity requirements. It would be very helpful if we can sort of develop a standard set that every municipality buying new charging stations can include, so that they get secure charging stations, but we also create an incentive in the market for manufacturers to really build secure charging stations. So this is something we start with. I think the first set was published in 2016, already April 2016. We did a brief update in 2019, and finally in February this year we published a completely new version. And the new thing is it's based on the IEC 62443 standard. So this is an industrial cybersecurity standard. And I want to tell you a bit about this new updated requirement set today. So a few things first, starting like why did we choose to build it on the 62443 standard? What's the advantage for you as a manufacturer or a buyer of the equipment? Then secondly, more practically, so if I'm a charge point operator or a manufacturer, how to actually implement the new requirement set, so what do we need to do to be compliant? And then for more municipality, a city, or someone buying the equipment, how would you actually use these requirements when you're procuring new charging stations? So let's start with the choice. So why did we choose 62443? So maybe a bit like how does it look now? So we have now 3 main documents. There's a threat analysis on the top. Then we have requirements for charging stations themselves. They're based on the 4-1 and 4-2. So 62443 is quite a large standard. There's multiple parts within the standard. But the 4-1 and 4-2 are the component level requirements, and we made a selection of requirements from these charging stations. And then on system level, for more the infrastructure used by charge point operators, we have selection from the 3-3 standard combined with the ISO IEC 27001 standard. And one of the main goals we had there is to make it certifiable. So there's a certification scheme available for the IEC 62443. And the goal would essentially be to make the charging station certifiable, so that basically you can check compliance with requirements through certification. I think we already had a question after Wilco's talk, so this is sort of the way we propose to do this. Practically, the requirements are freely available, so if you want to use them either as a buying part or if you want to comply with them, you can just go to our website or Elaad's website and you'll find them there. All the documents that I discuss are public. But so why the certification? This is mainly from the work we've did with municipalities. So me and Harm, we've been helping different cities and municipalities buying the charging stations. And what we see, it's quite difficult for them to use the requirements. There's multiple challenges they run into. One is often it's not quite sure when you start a new tender if it's actually feasible. So we still have a lot of doubt, like, are we not setting too high requirements? Is it actually feasible? So can we do this? And we think a lot of cities are not using requirements for this. Certification would be a major benefit there because you can just see at the start of the tender, like how many charging station manufacturers, how many CPOs already have the certificate. So you know in advance how many are actually meeting the requirements, which greatly reduces the risk and uncertainty during procurement. Second is organizing the test is quite costly and complex, especially if you're a smaller city and you want to buy a small set of charging stations, then the cost of a penetration test is expensive. There's very few people available with the right skills to test it, so to get them to do it, it costs a lot of money, and you need to sort of know how to formulate the right assignments so they focus on the right thing. The certification basically moves that responsibility to the manufacturer. So the manufacturer becomes responsible for doing the right testing and to make sure it's also done periodically, so you have continuous testing of the new equipment by the manufacturer themselves. Third thing we see is once you've tested it, actually the test results are not as easy to read if you're not used to this domain. So if you're a city or municipality buying the equipment and you're not really deep into the hardware technical stuff, it's difficult. You probably need someone like Wilco to help you read the report, to help you understand what the priorities are. And yeah, that's quite difficult to check. If we can just go to certification and we have reliable certificates, as a city you can just look, is there a certificate? If it's the right certificate, you can sort of know that it's meeting some basic level of security. And finally, we've seen a lot of cases that, okay, well, you've done the testing, you found a vulnerability, you've sort of prioritized them, then you go to the manufacturer, but it's quite difficult to get them fixed because the contract is already signed, you already sort of are stuck with this particular manufacturer, so then you sort of set up a roadmap to start fixing everything, but it's not the highest priority for the manufacturer. They're just going to the next standard, going to the next thing because they have a business priority for new customers. So we see often it takes years to find the vulnerabilities that are found after you've sort of signed the contract and do the penetration test. With certification, you move sort of testing forward, so the testing has to be done before you get the certificate. Also, the main vulnerabilities would have to get fixed before you get the certificate. So when you're buying the equipment as a city municipality, you already know that at least the big vulnerabilities have been fixed, have been taken out. Now, there's one caveat. This sounds very good, but it only works if the certification scheme works well. Like, it's quite difficult to set up good cybersecurity certification. Because it's difficult to set up like how deep do you need to test, how do you ensure that all the test labs that can give out a certificate do the same level of testing, do the same in-depth checks of the security? How do you know which vulnerabilities need to be fixed and everything? So it's quite difficult to set something up. And this is why we chose, like, well, let's not set up our own certification scheme. Let's use what's existing in the market, specifically the IEC 62443 scheme, which is being set up for industrial components, so specifically embedded types of components, which also include the charging stations. So this is the main reason why we wanted to have the 62443 based requirements, because if we do 62443, we can use the 62443 certification, and that will make buying secure charging stations much easier for cities, municipalities, provinces. There's one secondary reason, I think, that will also come back in the talk by Bart Thomas on the legislation. We see there's a lot of push from the EU on having more product security requirements through the Radio Equipment Directive, the Cybersecurity Issues, which mean you also have to meet some sort of harmonized standards. We don't know exactly what the harmonized standards will look like for the Cybersecurity Issues, but we do see 62443 at the moment as a quite well-positioned standard. So it could be, hopefully in the future also, if you meet the 62443, then you also sort of get the compliance with the Cybersecurity Issues automatically. This is not sure yet, but this is sort of the best guess we have now what the CRA will look like into the future. And hopefully Bart will tell a bit more about this area. So this is the reason now we come to how to implement this. So say I'm a charge point operator or an EV charging station manufacturer, what do I actually have to do to be compliant? So let's first look at what's in the document. So it's a bit more complex, this version, in that we have 3 different documents set up with requirements. We have a threat analysis, which you see on the left. We have then requirements for the charging station infrastructure, so that's the system as a whole, which is set up for the charge point operators. And then we have requirements for the EV charging station, so the individual equipment, which is more aimed at the manufacturers. So there's 2 reasons we did this. The first editions were only the requirements for the charging stations themselves. So what we decided is first to add the EV 211 part, the requirements for EV charging infrastructure, because we see it's not enough to have just a secure charging station itself. You have to sort of secure the whole system, also the central system, the connections to the outside. So the idea is to have a full system level security design with the EV 211. So that will be more the focus with this new version of the requirements. And then the threat analysis, so there's 2 reasons to do this. First, it's sort of a requirement if you want to do certification. So if you want to do IEC 62443 certification, basically they require you to base the requirements on a risk analysis or a threat analysis. So we provided this. But also more practically, it allows you to check the assumptions that we are making. So when we set the requirements, we're making certain assumptions about how you use a charging station, how your EV charging infrastructure looks. And basically we write down these assumptions in the threat analysis so that you can check, like, is the system description, is it correct? Are the threats that are considered, are they covering everything? Is the zoning model similar to what I use? And based on the system description, the threats, and the zoning model, there are certain security objectives defined for the charging infrastructure, which are then used to define the requirements. So the security objectives in EV 111 are linked to the requirements through the rationale that are in the letter 2 document. So basically, the threats gives the objectives, and the objectives then gives the requirement, and the rationale links everything together. And this helps you to use it. For instance, if I'm a charge point operator and I want to be compliant to this, the first thing you would do is actually check, do these assumptions hold in my particular case? So you first would take the EV 111 document, and then you check, so is the system description in there, is it actually the same as I have in my current situation? So for instance, there is a reference architecture including system description. You can see that on the right here. And it describes, for instance, the types of equipment that are there, the typical sort of zones, the network connections, but also the connections to the outside. So for instance, here we assume there is a customer portal where customers access this. There's a separate management portal for engineers and customer representatives. If you're a charge point operator and you buy equipment from an EV manufacturer, then you want to make sure that the supplier also implements the security requirements. So there's sort of a requirement in there that you pass on the technical requirement to the CPO, pass it on to your suppliers, to the EV charging manufacturers, possible to cloud operators, your cloud infrastructure, any other suppliers that sort of do the technical implementation. Second is that there are requirements for physical security. So ISO 27001 has generally quite general physical security requirements, more aimed at sort of buildings or selecting a secure office environment. What we've added there is that also if you buy charging stations that are properly secured, that you have proper physical security implemented on the charging station itself. Third is reporting incidents. I think there's been a lot of concern from some cities and municipalities that there have been incidents at their charge point operator and they didn't know about this. And I think this is a basic sort of trust issue. You want to know if you're buying sort of this charging service from a CPO that you know about their incident. So there's a requirement that if there's an incident at a CPO, it is reported to the city or municipality that's taking on the charging services. And the final example is there's also a requirement to segregate the charging stations from the internet. I think this is already mentioned. I mean, ideally you have at minimum sort of a private APN or VPN already to make sure they're not direct in network, plus then all the TLS stuff and stuff on top. But we want to avoid that the charge point operator really puts their charging stations directly on the internet, because then any vulnerability that's found would be directly exploitable. I think for public charging it's not that common, we haven't seen it that much, but for sort of consumer level charging stations it's unfortunately quite a common solution to put them directly on internet connections. Then the technical requirements, so there was selection made from the 3-3 standard. This is a system level standard from 62443. We had a so-called contextualizations where we sort of specified how the requirements should be interpreted for key areas. One thing was, for instance, to have multi-factor authentication if you have remote access, particularly for server administrators. There are requirements about separating different roles, but also to have account management. So, for instance, if you have your own administrators, to have some sort of centralized access control, so it's easier to manage the accounts, but also have some account management, for instance, for consumers that are on the consumer portal. The fourth, and that's a quite specific one, is to limit switching commands. I think from a grid operator's perspective, the main thing we're worried about is that someone switches off all the charging stations at the same time. So for instance, you have an administrator, the CPO, their account gets compromised, someone uses the account, and then just switches off all the charging stations at the exact same time. So one of the requirements is at least to limit the authorizations. There's normally not a use case where one user has to switch off everything at the same time. So there's a requirement to limit how much charging stations one user can normally switch. And we think that's important both for the compromised accounts, but also for insider threats. If you would have sort of a rogue employee that would be, somehow wanting to switch this, you also want to limit this. And from a grid perspective, we think that's one of the key protections. And finally, the requirement to have encryption and authentication of communication to the charging station. Particularly, I think the recommendation is to follow the OCPP standard, which uses TLS to secure the communication on the charge or the wide area network. Then, as a manufacturer, so 311, there's a similar set where you would like to check the assumptions. I think this is more difficult for the manufacturer than for the charge point operator, because for manufacturer, your charging station may be used in different environments, but it would make sense to at least check so all the interfaces there. There's a description of the user groups, which you see now on the right-hand side. So all are the users present, do they have the rights that are there? Of course, if there's more users that you have or extra interfaces, you want to add additional requirements. And also, if you see additional threats, you maybe want to take measures against this and then define additional objectives and requirements. And then if we come to the requirements for the charging station side, so they're split into two parts. One is on secure software development. This is the 4-1 part of the standard. So it basically says that you have to have a secure software development process. This includes things like the training or developments, what Wilco mentioned, make sure they know about the common vulnerabilities that are found in IoT equipment, but also make sure you have a vulnerability handling process, make sure you have a process to deliver patches to your customers, make sure you do your own threat assessments, that you have a defense in depth strategy. So there's sort of things to make sure that you really develop the charging station with security in mind, and hopefully also from the start, so security by design. We require all of the requirements from 4-1 to be implemented, because it's sort of a complete system, so you want to have all the processes in place for this one. And then from the technical requirements, so the more sort of technical implementation, we are selecting requirements from the 4-2. There we sort of made a selection of which requirements are relevant. And as for the 3-3, we added some contextualization to sort of explain how to interpret requirements for the EV charging station. Particular challenge there was the authentication. I mean, the 62443 just says you have to authenticate everything, but we see you need different types of authentication for different types of user groups. So for instance, for local engineers, at the moment we allow just simple authentication of username and password. So if someone comes to the charging station, opens the door, then we just, at the moment just require that there's a password to log in. This is, I think we would really like to have it stronger. I think we had stronger requirements in previous version, but we see it's technically not a feasibility, not that feasible yet, especially if things are offline to have this. I would expect that this is strengthened in future versions. For EV drivers, there we are aligned on the e-mobility service provider, so basically we require that you implement whatever the EMSP has implemented. Again, this is not ideal, so basically it is allowed to have the weak charging cards that Wilco talked about. From a security perspective, we don't want to have this. It's a vulnerability, but the problem, of course, if you build a charging station that doesn't have it, you can't really integrate it, so people cannot charge with it. So at the moment, we are allowing it, and basically we allow the EMSP to set it with the hope that the EMSPs in the future will set stronger requirements to counter the fraud. So this is sort of a gap, but it's sort of needed to have realistic requirements. For the CSMS authentication, we rely on the OCPP thing, so we require sort of the level of authentication. It's an OCPP. It's not technology dependent, so potentially you can use another protocol, other implementation, but we've made sure that's in line with this level of security you get there. So it's TLS with either basic authentications or password authentication, or client-side certificates on the EV side. And finally, for the EVs, so there is an option for having authentication using the 15118, the ISO 15118 certification also included. So if you have an EV that is authenticating to the charging station, then you basically have to have this level of authentication that's in that standard. Next is the encryption authentication. So everything that goes at least over the wide area network is required to be encrypted and authenticated. This can be done using TLS from the OCPP standard. We require signed firmware. So this is against the firmware manipulation that Wilco also mentioned. Maybe to stress, at the moment we are not requiring secure boot. I think the next step, so at the moment signed firmware means that when the firmware is installed, the charging station should check the signature on the firmware. If the signature is not right, it will reject it. If the signature is correct, it will install it on the charging station. Even stronger would be to have secure boot. That would mean that every time the charging station boots, it checks that the firmware has not been manipulated, that it's still right. So every time it basically the charging station boots, it checks the signature. That would be better because then it would also be secure against manipulating the hardware. So if someone would sort of break open the charging station, manipulate it on the flash, you would also be protected. We have not required it yet because we think for a lot of charging stations it's not feasible yet without a hardware upgrade. So if you use slightly older hardware, it's probably not feasible yet. But again, I would expect in the future versions we want to upgrade to the secure boot thing. And potentially it's also required for the radio equipment directive, but I think this is still a question to be answered if it's needed. But just to say, at the moment, if you don't have secure boot, you're okay, but do expect it will be upgraded in a future version of the standard. So the protection against physical manipulation at the moment is mainly for the casing, so to make sure that the casing of the charging station is tamper resistant, that you can see changes to it, and also there's some detection if, for instance, the door is opened. We could go further there, for instance, requiring all stored data to be encrypted, for instance. At the moment, this is not yet included, again, due to feasibility concerns, but again, this is probably something you want to do in the future. Also, what's new is there are some more privacy-oriented requirements also coming from the radio equipment directive. So, for instance, a requirement to be able to delete personal information that was not there in previous versions. And there's a requirement to have things hardened by default. So, for instance, having all these servers open on the charging interface is not allowed. Everything has to be closed off if it's not used by default. So these are typical things we see in the requirements. To make it easy to implement, we've added a mapping to the OCPP standard. So we've been, I think, working with the Open Charge Alliance for a while also to make sure that the OCPP protocol supports the security features with a full mapping sort of explaining which requirements from 62443 you can implement and how it can be done on OCPP. And the brief summary is everything that's related to OCPP can be done in OSPP. So there's no requirements in 62443 that cannot be done in OSPP, unless of course they're for a completely different protocol. And finally, we've mapped it to the harmonized standard that's been developed for the Radio Equipment Directive Delegated Act. Again, I think Bart Thomas from RDI will tell a bit more about this, but there's a standard now developed, EN 18031, that you have to sort of meet if you want to comply with the Radio Equipment Directive Cybersecurity Delegated Act. And we've made a mapping of that in a separate document, EV 313, also on the website, showing that you can meet almost all requirements. There's 2 requirements that are not covered, so that are in the harmonized standard that are not in our requirements. That's the secure boot requirement, and that's 2-factor authentication for financial things. These are only applicable if the charging station is handling financial transactions, and there's a bit of a question if this is the case or not, so I think this is something to look out for if as a manufacturer you have to comply to the 3rd part of the EN 18031 standard. So this is sort of the implementation part. Then finally, how to use the requirements in procurement. So we've talked now what you as a charge point operator have to do, what the manufacturer has to do, but now looking from the perspective of a city or municipality wanting to buy the charging station. I mean, in principle, the idea is just include the requirements directly in your tender document. So they've been set up in a way that you can just directly reference requirements when you're buying this. But the challenge is the assurance. So how do you sort of check that a vendor meets it? And as said, the ideal solution would be to have certification. So what we're working towards in the future is that as a city or municipality, you can just ask to a charge point operator or to a manufacturer, just provide me the certificate, and on the certificate I can just check if you're complying with the requirements. There are 2 problems yet why you cannot do this yet, and one is the short term why you cannot do it yet. That's there's not enough certified charging stations available in the market. I think at the moment I don't know of any. Maybe some manufacturers are in the process of getting certified, but there's not a lot yet, unfortunately. I think this is sort of chicken or egg problem. I mean, first requirements have to be there before you can get certified. So hopefully this will get things started. I think with ElaadNL we've been trying to set up some pilot projects, so we're trying to explore this and get at least 1 or 2 manufacturers sort of in the certification process. Hopefully that will make it easier. So, but at the moment it's sort of still too early to do this. So you have to wait until at least enough charging stations are certified before using it. And hopefully like in 1 or 2 years we have more options there. Longer term concern is that the 62443 certification is not as strong as we would like to be yet. So as I said, all the advantages you get from certification, they're dependent if the certification scheme is good, if it's strong. 62443, I think it's a good basis, but there's still some gaps in it. Like the requirements for test labs are not as strong as we would like to. I mean, ideally you want to have a very qualified test lab with very experienced testers doing it, but the requirements from 62443 are not as clear yet. So if you're lucky, you get a very strong test lab testing it, but potentially also you get a weaker test lab and they will find much less. And so we would like to have more sort of quality control, more sort of homogeneous test labs performing it. Similarly, the test method has some gaps, so we are not sure that every test lab that's doing it is doing the exact same step and doing the exact same test cases. So there's still some improvements to be done. Hopefully that will be fixed by the 62443 certification people. It's the IECE, the standardization body. If that doesn't happen, then probably as a critical infrastructure, you want to do some additional testing of your own. So for a small municipality, it's maybe still feasible to just use certification. But if you're a large CPO and you're under, for instance, NIS2 directive, probably you want to do more than a certification. Or also if maybe you're a large city or municipality and you feel you have to do more, you maybe want to do something extra. So to fill in this gap to the certification, there's work going on now on the new null requirements. So this null requirements that cities and municipalities use to do this. They're referencing the ENCS ELAAD requirements, but there's something additional in there on how to test them. Specifically, it requires CPOs to do their own penetration testing, with periodic testing every 2 years, at least 10 days of testing by a qualified penetration test, a qualified hacker. And finally also to share the vulnerability mitigation plans, have some transparency about what's been found and also how it's going to be mitigated by the purchasing party. And we think like this is not ideal because, for instance, it's difficult to check how is the penetration tester qualified enough, what does 10 days means, how much of the 10 days are actually testing time. I mean, there's still some room there in the quality of the test, but at least it provides a very good baseline to get it tested. So this is the short-term solution to the certification is at least in a better state. So I think that was the overview of the requirements. I don't know if there's any questions or...
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting. Actually, I have a question about the very last slide that you showed. What is this null assurance requirements? Because I'm familiar with the NKL basis sets. How does this relate to that?
Sorry, I mean, it indeed will be part of the new NKL basis set. There will be some requirements specifically on how to do testing and insurance. So it will be part of the updated version.
And this is the advice of the null security task force to the NKL group.
This is what you sent us.
Yes, yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Sorry, yeah.
More questions?
Is there a specific entity responsible for maintaining and overseeing the certification scheme in this case? Is this also the EICE, or is it because it's 62443, or is that separate?
No, for IEC 62443, the IECE is responsible for overseeing it. Potentially in the future there may be a European scheme based on 62443, then the supervision would be sort of moved to national certification bodies, but the current scheme is really IECE based.
There was another question here.
Yeah, my question was regarding this slide as well. So as a CPMS software as a service provider, we should be part, right, of this testing that the CPO has to do. But if we are validating multiple CPOs, I think in the Netherlands already 8 or 9, would they rely on a single result from us as a provider, or should they individually go through this testing process?
I think it's sort of also a negotiation between you and the buyers, because I think it's not that precise. My view, it would be enough to have one report that you can show, of course, that, and then repeat it every 2 years to do that. I would take into account maybe also the criticality, so maybe 10 days if you are sort of supplying to 8 or 9 people, maybe a bit on the low side, but generally I think doing one good test is better than doing 8 short tests that are not as strong.
Yes, regarding 62443, you have actually 4 levels of security. So my question is, from which level do you need to do real physical testing with the device? Is that already from level 1 or?
We have a mix, so there's different, it needs different security levels, so sort of 4 being at sort of nation state level, 3 more professional hacker, 2 more sort of script kiddie level roughly. We have a mix, so we didn't adhere to one security level. Basically remotely, if you can do remote attack, we want to be at security level 3. But for physical security, we are allowing security level 2 at the moment. Ideally would also go to security level 3, but we see some issues with the visibility. So roughly we are at security level 2 against physical attacks, security level 3 against remote attacks that are affecting multiple charging stations.
We have time for one more question, and then there's also the break to ask more questions.
Yes, hello. Thank you. It was a nice presentation. My question is, what is a qualified hacker and how do we know? And another question, if as an EV charging station manufacturer we procure penetration testing, then do you have any guidelines to those security research companies to how to conduct those tests?
Yeah, I think this is one of the gaps that we don't have in the current requirements. I think we don't have a very hard definition what a qualified hacker is. Generally, if you want to get one, I think it's looking at the experience. Have they tested this kind of equipment in the past? How many years of experience they have? I think typically what sort of, for instance, lead tester have sort of 5 years of experience in the area at least to be involved in this. So I think it's more sort of that kind of requirements that you're thinking of. Of course, still it has to be then defined what's in the area, because probably they don't have specific charge point knowledge, but maybe you want to have embedded testing knowledge if you do a charging station, or for instance more application level testing for the CSMS. So it's having this relevant experience there.
Thank you, Maarten. Now we go to the break, so another applause for Maarten. Thanks. And we have a 30-minute break, so we start at 2:45, and then we'll start with Bruno. After that, Bart from RDI, and then we have the live hacking demo. So see you in 30 minutes. So we will continue with our second part of the program, and therefore I would like to invite on stage Bruno van Hoek. Bruno is my colleague at ElaadNL, but he's also the chair of the EVC ISAC. Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you. Okay. Well, my mic is working?
Yeah, I'll fix that.
Yeah? Okay. Well, that's better. Good morning. Nice to see so many familiar faces, also new faces. I'm here to talk about the EVC ISAC. Also, it started with, like all good things, with harm. A couple of years ago, and well, the ball got rolling, and now we have an EVC ISAC. Last year we have founded the EVC ISAC. In October we had our festive opening at Vattenfall. My colleague Jos from the ISAC is sitting over there, also part of the board of the ISAC. I am the chair of the ISAC, and we have now 9 members, but that I will comment later on. For those, show by hands, who have heard of ISAC. Okay, that's nice. Well, after this session, all of you will know what ISAC is. Information Sharing and Analysis Center. It's a place where professionals can share information on threats, on knowledge, help each other, and what measures do they take at their local companies. And after that, you can imagine that there must be a lot of trust between ISAC members. Because if you tell about your own vulnerabilities, there must be a trust basis. So we worked a year long on building a team to trust each other. That also means that when you have new members coming in, everybody has to feel comfortable with a new member. So last year, after a year-long project, we started it, and in October, like I said, 24. Well, which companies are already in the ISAC? In alphabetical order, we have Alpha, Eneco, Elaad, of course, but only for a couple of years, because we aren't exactly a CPO or a MSP, but we are involved, like lots of other things. Equens is the last member who entered. Fastnet, Greenflux, Last Mile Solutions, Mylens, and Vattenfall. Well, we have meetings every 2 months, and you can imagine that we want some CPOs, we want some MSPs, we want software developers, we want hardware developers. Well, we have 2 software developers, SaaS systemen, Greenflux and Last Mile Solutions, who cover a great deal of the market. Like that is important, I will comment on that later on. Of course, we work also with the National Cybersecurity Center as a sort of head of all ISACs in the Netherlands. They support ISACs, and in the sector of charging infrastructure there wasn't an ISAC, and there is now one. Why do we need an ISAC? The need for cyber resilience. You can imagine lots of topics can come by. For example, availability of data, which is a threat. But also, everybody remembers when in Spain a couple of weeks ago, the power went down, which wasn't necessarily a cyber attack, but that is kind of the holy grail for an attacker, a stately attacker will go for, to disrupt a nation because the power went down. And in our grid, we have several attack vectors. We have solar, we have wind, and we have, of course, EV charging. And for example, in Spain, we had a drop of 15 gigawatt in the power. It was vanished within a couple of minutes. And we have a 50 hertz frequency balance that dropped 1 hertz. Well, that's a lot. When we drop 1/10 of a hertz, we already can have transformers go down and so on and so on. So that grid balance is of great importance. Here you see that it was around noon, a drop of 15 gigawatt vanished from the grid in Spain. Well, when you have, for example, I have calculated, someone else calculated it for me. You have about, suppose you have 300,000 cars charging. That equals 3 gigawatts of charging energy. When that drops, you have a dip of 3 gigawatts, and that is the reserve in the European grid. Well, that can go tumbling, transformers down, the domino stones can go falling, and so on. And even, like in Spain, some power plants can go down like that. Well, how can an ISAC help? Well, that's to increase robustness. We have a sector, we have now 9 members in the EVC ISAC, but the sector is over 100 companies. We want to grow, but I don't want more than 30 or so companies in the ISAC, because if you do, research shows that if you do more, that conflicts with the level of trust. So if the group is too big, trust gets hard. But how do we reach all those other companies with information, with knowledge? And that is a puzzle. But okay, we started and we are working on that. We want to improve cybersecurity together. Of course, with standards and requirements. We heard the 62443, with craftsmanship. Cybersecurity is a field of expertise. It's a profession. If a small company thinks, okay, we must have cybersecurity, someone, and the chief financial officer thinks, okay, I will also spend my time on cybersecurity, then you miss perhaps something. Might not. Building an understanding, creating awareness, and of course the legislation, NIS2, WMB, RDE, on the program for this afternoon, and the CRA. All those things can be talked about in the ISAC, but it are all areas we can focus on. What can also be talked on in the ISAC is working together, threat intelligence. Well, you can look at new technologies, education, awareness. So we aim to not only have sessions with the 9 members of the ISAC, but also do special events where we grab a topic and discuss that. This afternoon is also already an example, not of that, but it could be. Sharing knowledge and information. The EVC ISAC meetings are a time and a place to discuss topics. This is done via the TLP protocol, traffic light protocol. You have red, amber, green, clear. So topics which are discussed, if a topic is red, well, you cannot do anything. You just discuss it with each other. You don't write it down. You don't record it. This, anyhow, is that a no-go. What you want is, of course, not red, but you want amber. You want to bring some information outwards. So you have to get topics. When the topics are red, you want to strip it from confidential information and make it amber. So green, of course, can be shared, and clear is also shareable via internet. We use the DTC platform as a safe haven for information. The DTC platform, that's a community from the Digital Trust Company. We have, with the National Cybersecurity, we work on the Cyber Resilience Network to bring information and knowledge into all kinds of sectors of the vital industry, also like energy. Well, sharing knowledge and information, when you focus on the ISAC, we have the Energy ISAC. I work closely with Peter Baart already, sitting over there, the chairman of the Energy ISAC. And of course, we have sessions with the project leader who was involved in setting up the EVC ISAC. He consulted us, is now active in the Wind ISAC to bring there an ISAC. We have connections with Holland Solar. They want our ISAC also, and not for nothing, it are all switchable energy sources in the grid. And switchable means that when there is a hack, you can Martin said it all, you can bring it down. That's the worst nightmare. When you have an IT backend, you can influence, you can bring the net down. Well, I heard I have 1 minute. Keep it safe. I'd like to talk to you again in what is a year or so to inform you on how the ISAC is growing and how we are making steps also internationally, because the problems don't stop at the border. It's an international issue. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I see one.
In your impact analysis, you mentioned 300,000 cars charging needed to be affected more or less simultaneously to get to the 3 gigawatt limit. Do you know if there's any specific vendor that has 300,000 charging points? Because I saw the aggregate numbers, but is there any specific one that exceeds that threshold?
No. If every car charges 100 kilowatt, and you have, when you have a coordinated cyber attack on, for example, Greenflux and last mile solutions, and you can influence the SaaS system, then you can influence the charging stations connected to those simultaneous charging sessions. Also, the prognosis are for over a couple of years. So the EV market is growing, as you can see on the slide. December 24, we are still getting more and more EVs and more charge points. So the problem is only getting more realistic. Yeah.
And I think there are CPOs that have over 100,000 charges already in their back end. So it's growing. More questions? Then I do have one, Bruno. I still have one. So actually, you said multiple companies, so they're actually competitors, but they're working together. So how do you keep trust?
Competitors, yeah, that's a good one. We leave commerce outside the door. That's the understanding. And of course, it never works 100% because if you have a vulnerability and you want to keep it for yourself, then you don't share anything. But we have an understanding that we work together on a professional level and not on a commercial level. So, in fact, I was a bit hesitant of that, but it is working very well. They are sharing, and that means that they already trust each other. When a new member comes in, we have to see how that goes, but it will go well. I trust that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. So now we will continue with the last part of the afternoon program, which will be live hacking. And we could obviously choose a charger to do that, but I think some people here then would get very nervous. So we didn't do that. So what we did is, together with Wilco, we're going to show you basically the process on how the same attack would work on a charger. And what we will do here is we have a simple router, which is quite old. And what we will showcase is that by pinpointing at some points on the board, so the actual hardware, we can find some places which might be interesting to look and dive into further. So that's what we will do on stage live. And I will try to talk you through. So I hope that the...
All right.
Martijn, can you start the camera on the desk here?
Maybe first have a look at the screen. Then we
Yeah,
can
okay.
reports go.
And can you enable Wilco's microphone? Yeah, okay. So the device is now online, so we enabled it, and we can do a port scan. And what you basically can see is there are 3 ports open. HTTP probably is the web interface, but the one we're actually interested in here is SSH. So this device has the SSH port open, which we might be able to control it. But logging into SSH usually requires a password, and we don't have that. But the password maybe is on this device. So what we will do next is look at the actual device. So if we can go to the camera screen again. Yeah, it shows a password. So if we enable such a device and we find some pins, then you can see on the screen, this means on this pin there's communication. And I already knew it's this pin, so I cheated a bit. We checked it before, obviously. But there's some communication here. And this tells us that this pin might be interesting to dive into further. So Wilco has a device here which he connected to his laptop, and this enables him to connect to the UART, and we heard that before today, disable UART, keep that in mind, to this device. So what we need to do is put those pins on. The third one was ground, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Let's not fry it. Happened before. But it's all safe, it's 12 volts, so it's not really an issue. Let's see if this works.
All right.
I can restart it. Can we go to the screen of the laptop again, Martijn? So Wilco will now connect to this small device here, which enables us to listen to the communication. He will set it up. So it's setting to UART, default settings, 3.3 volts, so that we don't actually fry it. And then he puts it into bridge mode. And now I enable the device. And what you will see is information from this actual device flowing on screen. And it's the bootloader that starts up, and eventually it will start booting some Unix version, some Linux version. So this tells us that we probably can do some bad stuff. So I will reboot it again, because at some point, and you might miss it, but it says auto booting continues, and you can interrupt that. So Wilco will now interrupt the auto booting. There it is. And this is the actual bootloader. So this is the place where you can set the parameters to actual boot into Linux from a specific address on the flash memory and everything. And that shows it here. So these are the commands that get executed, and the boot command, boot CMD. So it actually is on that address. And you can print something that's on that address, or at least show a tiny bit of it. So that's great. But what can we do with this? Because it's not really something you could do with it, right? So what Wilco can do is he can use this. He can fully dump the information from that address on into a file, which basically means that we have the firmware of this device. So he has a script that is a Python script with some preset settings that allows him to do this. And we start on that specific address, and we can do that now.
That's Python code. Ah, I'm audible. Nice. All right, so let's dump that and give it an F file name. Firmware.bin. So you will see that this takes a long time. It's going to take about 30 minutes to dump this flash. So let's not do that live.
Yeah, I'll have to wait here now for 30 minutes. No, just kidding. We did a pre-dump of this because it takes some time.
So we have the prepared dump here. And let me move it up again. Firmware dump prepared.
And now he uses binwalk, which is basically a tool to extract this information from that firmware binary.
That's not formatted great.
And here you can see it has some different sections. So it has a squash FS and a JFS2. These are sectors that are interesting for us. And what Wilco wants to find is the shadow file, because the shadow file contains the hash of the root user. Hey, there it is. You found it, Wilco.
So we have two shadow files actually. In Linux, like Harm said, the shadow file is the file that stores the password hashes. And SquashFS is a file system that cannot be changed by the device, so it's static. And JFFS2 is a file system that can be changed, so most likely the most recent password is stored in this file.
So there it is.
And then we have, well, this doesn't really look like the password, and indeed it's not the actual password, because this is a password hash. So we need to try to crack this hash.
Yeah, we need to crack it.
So we can use hashcat for that. Attack mode 0 basically says use a dictionary, so a large list of possible passwords. We try to generate the hash for that, and then see if that matches the hash that was in the file. 500 is the type of hash in this case, which we looked up previously. And then we can enter the hash and also the dictionary file.
And this can take a long time. So if you have a word list, it's quite fast.
Oh, I already cracked it previously.
You need to delete the file.
Yes.
So usually this takes some time because you start brute forcing it. A word list is faster than actually brute forcing all different.
Don't look at this. There we go. Still pretty quick.
So in the top, almost at the top, you see this is the cracked password for this hash of this specific device. And that means that we know the SSH password.
So this.
But we're not there yet. We're not there yet.
So just to show this ROCU file, that Nano doesn't like that. It's just a large list of possible passwords. So it's just trying these passwords one by one and seeing if that matches the hash.
So if you are in search for a password, use this list. Always works.
All right, let's reboot the router to get it out of the bootloader mode.
I will disable this one. Because now we don't need the pins anymore. We extracted the firmware, extracted the hash, cracked the password. Now it's done. Almost.
So it's going to take a little bit for the router to boot up again.
You see the LEDs here.
And then, well, as you saw in this demo as well, so once we get access to a device, for example, a charging station, we only need physical access to one device, and we can then extract the password that we would be able to use to attack a charging station, any charging station that uses this password via the network.
So have unique passwords per charging station, because if you don't, we probably already know it. And this attack can be done on some chargers too. So, and we really did this attack. But for showcasing, we do it on a router because it's the same process.
It's taking its time. Try reconnecting.
So we're now connected via the Ethernet cable to the router.
Let's see if the connection is working.
Connected already.
Oh, oops. It's a little bit too much.
Yeah. Now it requests the password, but we know that one.
If I can type it correctly. Yes, there we go.
ID, there we go, your root. So long story short, disable these maintenance interfaces, especially when you're running them after production, because there is no use for it anymore. And once you have it enabled and we get access to it or somebody else, they can just find the password, but also find maybe API keys, keys to backend, OSPP credentials, everything. You can find it in there. So use the requirement from ElaadNL because it tells you to not enable this. Thank you. So now it's time for the networking drink. So I want to thank you for today. It's been a packed afternoon, but I think it was very interesting. Feel free, if you have any questions, to come to us, and let's chat over the drinks. Thank you.